Mass Soviet-style mobilization requires expensive infrastructure and cadres being maintained for it even in the peacetime, just in case. In the post-Soviet era these inefficient expenses were cut. Why mass mobilization in Russia won't work? Regarding mobilization, Putin can declare it, indeed, but it will be a risky decision. The USSR maintained a massive infrastructure for the total mobilization which has been mostly dismantled in post-Soviet Russia. Mobilization is more likely to trigger political chaos. Imagine, the government declared a total mobilization and millions of young males are drafted into the army. What next? Now you need to 1. Test and allocate them. Who goes where? 2. Train and arm them. 3. Quarter and feed them. 4. Place them under the capable officers and COs. In order to execute 1. 4. In case of the war, you need to maintain massive excessive capacities in the peacetime. And the Soviet Union did. One reason why Soviet army was so horribly excessive is that it maintained enormous excessive capacities just in case of mobilization. Soviet army maintained lots of excessive training schools and centers, training grounds, rooms to quarter the soldiers, excessive arsenals and storages of everything way more than it would ever need in the peacetime. That was for the total mobilization. Moreover, Soviet army maintained plenty of incomplete military units, just in case. These were military bases with all the infrastructure and weaponry, lots of officers and COs and very, very few soldiers. These units could not and were not supposed to fight in the normal time. Incomplete units were maintained for one single purpose. When the USSR launches total mobilization and drafts millions into the army, these units gonna absorb them. Excessive officers gonna get tons of soldiers under their command, and incomplete units gonna become full ones. In other words, much of the Soviet army wasn't and couldn't be functional in the peacetime. These were not the functional units, but the frames of military units that would be filled with the human meat only in the case of total mobilization. That was their only purpose. For many decades the USSR maintained all the infrastructure for the total mobilization, but never launched it. That was horribly expensive. Soviet Union made every effort to maintain its overblown military, but after its fall Russian military expenditures collapsed. In the first half of the 1990s military establishment refused to accept the new reality and demanded to fund the army on nearly Soviet level. Impossible. In reality the chronically underfunded army lost its capacities. In 1991 to 1996 Russia went through de facto demilitarization. I would say that the turning point came around 1997. Consider the military industry. Around 1997 the official narrative of conversion equals produce civilian goods and pay your own bills changed to the narrative of survival equals which military plants have actually survived. I think this was largely a result of the Chechen wars. Sometimes around 1996 to 1997 Kremlin took a decision to stop the de facto demilitarization and try to maximize its military capacities with those minimal resources they had. So they appointed Sergeyev as a Minister of Defense. Generalizing a bit, I would say that the concept of Sergeyev was 1. Build as strong strategic rocket forces as we can. 2. Maintain a small expeditionary contingent for the foreign wars. That's it, in theory. In reality around 1997 he had money just for 1, but not for 2. Still, the ethos of the new Russian army worked out and Sergeyev Zero was 1. Very strong rockets arm, high priority. 2. Not so strong land army, low priority. In reality we just need to be able to launch a limited foreign expedition, that's it. Sergeyev was too busy building, 1. Plus his resources were limited, so it was only Serdyukov who actually started building, 2. A strong expeditionary corpus-style land army, modern, functional but limited in size. We're lucky Putin fired this guy and purged his team. In other words, the post-1997 ethos of the Russian army amounted to 1. Strong strategic rocket forces, 2. Strong expeditionary corpus, limited in size. There was no place for the Soviet-style total mobilization army in this paradigm. New paradigm excluded possibility of mobilisation. New Russian leadership de facto abandoned any plans of total mobilization. Don't get me wrong, it wasn't about saving human lives. That was about the optimal allocation of financial resources for the most part. If you need to build, 1, and 2, you need to cut other expenses. Once Russian military leadership accepted the idea it gonna survive on the very limited budget, 1997, they had to accept very economic and accountant-style thinking. Efficiency, optimal allocation of resources, cut the inefficient expenses and invest into something more efficient. What expenses were the least efficient in their new paradigm? Well, everything associated with the obsolete Soviet paradigm. Everything necessary for the total mobilization. Excessive infrastructure, excessive units, excessive cadres. That was all inefficient expenses to be cut. That's why Serdyukov is hated so much. Rule of thumb: if someone is universally hated within a professional corporation, that almost always means he is acting against the corporate interests. Serdyukov was cutting the excessive infrastructure and units, firing people, hence, hatred. Dismantling of the infrastructure built for the total mobilization, firing the officers who were supposed to lead the mobilized. Dismantling the incomplete army units meant that Russian army lost capacity to absorb the millions of new recruits. It can't do mobilization anymore. That doesn't mean Putin won't declare mobilization. That just means it would be really stupid for him to do so. There are no excessive schools and grounds to train of new recruits. There are no excessive longings to quarter them. There are no excessive officers to lead them. Paradoxically enough, it is much harder to conduct a proper mobilization in the course of the foreign war. First, most of the capable officers who could have trained and led new recruits are in Ukraine. Many of them are dead already. Many cadre units which could have either served as sponges, absorbing new recruits, or as a source of officers and co's for the new units are already destroyed. They could have been promoted into officers in the new levy en masse, if they were not key months ago, which means Putin absolutely can launch a mobilization. He just won't be able to build a capable army out of this recruits. There is no frame that could absorb this new cannon fodder to form the new, capable military units. Actually, there is much less frame now than 7 months ago. Now add to this a logistics problem. Russia is absurdly centralized country. All the airlines, all the autoroutes, and most importantly all the railways are centered in one single hub, the city of Moscow. That is by far the most important logistical hub in the country. Let me give you an example. Consider the warehouse building statistics, 2004 to 2009. As you see, the lion's share of new warehouses are being built in Moscow. Red. For logistical reasons, almost all goods in Russia will pass through Moscow and will be stored here. Same with soldiers. Just as trade flows necessarily pass through Moscow and goods are being stored on Moscow warehouses, human flows will be passing here as well. In case of mobilization, Moscow will be flooded by the mobilized troops, many of whom gonna be stuck here for long, 'cause bad logistics. In case of mobilization, there will be 1. Tons of new, unmotivated recruits. 2. Where they'll be sent to Ukraine, where they likely die or get maimed. 3. Stuck in Moscow, in proximity to the seat of power. That's revolutionary situation. That is BTW exactly the scenario of 1917 revolution in Russia. In November 1916, Nicholas started suspecting his Ministry for Internal Affairs Protapopov of disloyalty and started vetting other candidatures. He offered Protapopov's position to Krasizhanovsky. Krasizhanovsky said, "Yeah, I could be a minister, but I have a condition. There are 460,000 reserve troops quartered in the imperial capital of St. Petersburg. These are mobilized peasants, very unmotivated. They know they'll soon be sent to the World War I trenches, where they die. I want you to 1. Transfer some of them to the city police with an exemption from the military service. 2. Relocate the rest the fuck out to the capital. That's my condition if you want to see me as a minister. Nicholas ignored it. 3 months later the Russian Empire fell. It were not the workers or peasants who did the February and then the October Revolution. It were first and foremost the 460,000 conscripts of the St. Petersburg garrison, who were stuck in the capital cause logistics and found themselves close to the seat of power. The end.